introduce yourself so that we don't get lost in conversation?
Yeah, of course. My name is Tim Pappa. Of relevance to this discussion, I used to be an agent with FBI, and I was with FBI for almost 16 years. And the last almost 6 years of my time there, I was a profiler with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Um, Prior to the FBI, I spent a little time at Defense Intelligence Agency. And then in grad school, I spent time at Central Intelligence Agency. I don't have a typical background for prior bureau in terms of being in the military or law enforcement. That wasn't my background. My background was mostly right out of graduate school. So as much as that's changing these days, there's less police officers and less former military in the FBI than there was. It's not just accountants and lawyers, right? It's much more diverse in that respect. But yeah, my background was more in research. And that research background was also in journalism. So in grad school, I spent time overseas in Indonesia doing research, ethnographic research on communication practices. And that experience really became the foundation for um, a lot of my work at BAU and some of my approach on UAPs.
BAU, UAP. Can you de-acronym it for
Yeah,
us?
yeah. BAU is Behavioral Analysis Unit.
Thank you.
And UAP, I know it was identified aerial phenomena. I think now it's unidentified anomalous phenomena.
Yeah, it depends on who you're talking to.
Right. UFOs,
Yeah, just
etc.
so it's clear in my mind, so you're still with the FBI?
No, I'm not currently with
Okay.
FBI. So going back to October 2023, I transitioned the private sector. I work in the cybersecurity field. But a lot of my research interests are still in areas related to behavior and psychology, even outside of that space.
So I'm going to ask you a current question, but since you were a behavioral analysis person, do you have any thoughts on the poor soul who tried to kill President Trump and other people in Pennsylvania a few days ago? I mean, I'm not looking for sensationalism. I'm just like really into any insight that you have of, when you see that, given your background, what do you think?
I wouldn't describe it as insight. I would describe it just as really an approach, right? So no matter who it is, no matter what the circumstances are, any approach in an event like that is going to be focused on, yes, we want to know individual things about that person and what shaped them. But if you're looking at someone who engaged in violence like that, a lot of people are quick to point to there's going to be some kind of pathway to violence. And those are pretty established frameworks in scholarship and among practitioners. If they want to apply it as a framework, that's never going to be completely comprehensive, but certainly those kind of pathways would suggest that this individual experienced things that he took as grievances, and perhaps he collected those grievances, and he didn't make the kind of meaning we would hope he would make out of those
Right.
experiences. And that something or some things or some people um, amplified his choices in those final days for him to take that kind of action. But I mean, that kind of approach in terms of looking at someone behaviorally before, during, and after an event like that often provides some of the best insight into why they made those choices. Something I always go back to, no matter what it is I'm looking at, and I would apply it to this individual as well, is stepping back and remembering how dynamic people are and how dynamic their decision making is. And that is often lost in a lot of analysis, right? And
Right.
even if there's limits to what we know about how they made the decisions or who impacted them, just keeping that kind of posture, I have often found grounds you when you're trying to engage in analysis for why they did that and trying to understand other aspects of that person. I would say one takeaway out of many of being in law enforcement for as long as I was that because you see so much of the good and bad side of people's lives and choices, it definitely gives you perspective on just how holistic you have to look at people and how dynamic people are, and that it's not about good and bad, right? So
Right.
I don't have more insight than that, but that's always the starting point for how do I want to understand this person and what they did.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm really excited already about that you bring in. I mean, I'm not specifically in this case, but just about what you just brought up in terms of understanding people,
Mhm.
because you talked about how important it is to understand how dynamic people are, but you also talked about how important it is to understand dynamics themselves. So past, present, and future, what's the storyline of a person? And what are the similar storylines across people who do similar things? And what are the differences? What are the surprise sort of standouts? And I think that I was just talking last night with someone about profile analysis of sounds. You can
Mm.
two different sounds that have the same frequencies, the same ingredients, can have different timbres. They sound like an oboe playing the same note has a different timbre than a flute or a
Mm.
guitar, right? And the timbre is the profile over the frequencies of each of these sort of pieces. So it just sort of makes me think of how to think of humans as this a bunch of different elements or aspects, and then the profile over those aspects, even if everyone has the same aspects and even in the same direction, that the profile can really feel different and that that's dynamic. That's just not some static sculpture, but it changes over time. And it changes over time in relationship with the environment,
Mm.
right?
Yeah. And I definitely, probably what I would point to the most in that kind of context are relationships with
Yeah.
other people. I mean, I think it's always helpful when you're considering all those things. Like, well, let me look at my own life, right? Let me look at my own life and how other people influence me. When I would think about how will a decision maker who's say the head of a country, how are they going to make a decision? I didn't really ever engage in that kind of analysis, but I always thought from a distance that's got to be incredibly difficult unless unless you have some insight into the relationships in their lives that really matter. And so when people would come to us at BAU and say, "What do you need from us? What can we give you to help you do your analysis?" One thing I would always say is like, I want to know who they love and who they hate. Like, I want to know the people closest to them um, that fit those kind of descriptions, because more than likely, no matter what I say about their personality or who they hope to be seen as, or those other aspects of self concept, ultimately, I think it's going to be the relationships in their lives that really drive their choices. And that if you manipulate those or you understand those, you're probably going to have the best insight into the decisions that people will likely make. And then obviously getting as specific as you can get. Um, Understandably, if you look at the approach of behavioral analysis, um, the behavioral analysis units were unique in some sense because a lot of behavioral shops don't always have that kind of combination of experienced investigators and intensive psychological training and application. We did still have psychologists and psychiatrists there embedded or on contract, but a lot of behavioral shops don't always have everybody together in the same room. And that was really important in terms of trying to look at things a little bit differently. Like, as an investigator, yes, I'm looking for the next step in this case to drive my investigation. When you get to BAU, the first thing they tell you is stop thinking about the investigation, look at behaviors. That's the shift that you're looking for, and that takes people a little while to get used to that. Like, that's what I'm really focused on, and what can I tell this investigator about the behaviors I'm seeing. So certainly I would reflect on a lot of moments in my career during interviews or other engagements where I was counting on my own gut reaction, my own experience, my own thoughts on what I thought would work. And I wasn't applying theoretical frameworks to it. I wasn't applying behavioral analysis to it. Not that it didn't work from my perspective because I didn't do that, but um, I think what's so valuable about it and all these kind of dynamics and contexts is you're taking an indirect approach. You're taking some other kind of framework and applying it to it to see what you see from it, which is not always going to be definitive, but that goes much farther than someone's opinion, right? And I think that's why behavioral analysis continues to be so valuable to a lot of people as a different type of approach to look at behaviors and those dynamics that you're talking about that are so complicated.
Wow. I I only had a little hiccup. I mean, all that made a lot of sense to me. I just had a little hiccup when you talked about manipulating someone's relationships
Hmm.
because I thought, well, is that ethical? Like if you know that they're guilty of a crime and you're trying to sort of trap them
Uh,
and you know for sure they're guilty, that feels like maybe that's ethical, but is it ethical to manipulate someone's relation? I mean, that's so intimate, you know?
what
Ethical
maybe?
in, I'm sorry,
Yeah, go
but
ahead. Sorry.
ethical for whom? I mean, I think what your mission
Huh.
is and what you're trying to do, I think is part of the answer of whether or not it's ethical. I'm sorry, Tim, go ahead.
No, no, that definitely that I would share that perspective on it. Okay, from one perspective, you could say, is it an issue of taxonomy here? Like I said, manipulate. Could I have said influence? Yes. Could I have said persuade? Yes. And but it's what I would like that person to do that ultimately makes a difference. Sure. In a lot of these situations, yes, you're talking about from a starting point, these are predicated investigations, and yes, those can be debatable, right, in terms of in a public sphere what people think is predicated or justified. But in terms of like legal authorities and investigative authorities and policies, you have a predicated investigation. That means there's some element or degree of probable cause, and we're investigating it because of that. And when they would come to BAU, we would be in a support role, but trying to understand relationships from a psychological perspective, what we're really talking about is I would like this person who's the target of this investigation to be open to talking to our person, or I would like them to be responsive to it. Could we say we're manipulating them? Yes, you could say that. I actually think, even though it's probably not what people would default to, I think when you talk about Russian approaches to influencing, like reflexive control, there are paradigms of that. It
Wait,
actually
what's reflexive control?
reflexive control is a methodology to that's been around for many decades from a lot of Russian theorists in terms of how they influence other people to make decisions. And it's actually not about controlling behavior, it's about managing behavior. And the thing that's very different about it, and you can look at many examples of this today and in the near past, of what has likely been Russian reflexive control in terms of perhaps how they've tried to influence dynamics in different countries, including the United States. The core of it, of managing behaviors, is understanding the pathway of how someone consumes information, who they get it from, and how they make a decision. So in many aspects, you don't really have to be there for it. You don't have to be present to try and influence someone. If you understand already that, these are my news sources of information. These are the kind of people I get information from. These are the people that brief me, and this is how I make my decision. Russian reflexive control would say, let's try to insert information in there that could be manipulated, may not be manipulated. It could be repurposed, it could be framed in a different way, could be fabricated. But the whole point is there's really not the stamp of a foreign government on it. It just appears it has entered that stream and it's going upstream.
What's
And
reflexive about it? In other words, it reduces your sort of conscious intention, so it's more like a reflex. I'm trying to understand
yeah,
the
I
nomenclature.
think another word would say it's people are behaviorally responsive to it. That if you know that this is their stream and how they make decisions, you drop something in that stream and they're probably going to respond to it. This is likely how they're going to respond to that behaviorally. And so when they say reflexive control, again, they're really talking about managing behaviors. As an example, and I don't know if this is exactly what was done, but as an example, if they create platforms on social media that look and feel like some reflection of a political party, and they say things that look and feel like real people who do that, they more than likely know there are communities, there are audiences that get their information from there, and no one's going to see that this came from Moscow. It's going to look and feel organic. And so if you know you're trying to reach a particular decision maker, you can kind of map that out. It's a little bit of a different approach, and I'm really going to simplify this by saying it this way, but I think generally speaking, historically, the West, or at least the United States, their approach to trying to influence or even um, put out, disseminate propaganda outside the US to other countries has really been to package things and kind of throw it over the wall and hope it lands. And it usually doesn't. And I think when you look at
That's like a trash balloon.
yeah, if you look at some of the reports that came out in the past couple of years from the major platforms like Meta, X, looking at like what they have described as perhaps Western origin influence campaigns, you see things that in those reports from what they've gathered of fake accounts, fake platforms that are actually have gotten better than they used to be. They're in that foreign language. They appear to be sites, so they may have a little bit more credibility to people or authority. But there's really no specific audience. It's very broad. And so we would say that that's not really going to land with people because it's a broad audience. You're really just throwing it out there and hoping it sticks. Reflexive control would be much more specific. Say, and
So you're charting someone's network
you
essentially.
are, and it's very
Yeah.
individual to that person, if possible, right? Anything you know about them, even though there's going to be limitations. So yeah, you academically even you could look at this as a Venn diagram of influence and persuasion and compliance, and you're hoping to achieve some kind of objective there. Ultimately, providing behavioral analysis to investigations and operations is about trying to align a behavioral goal with an investigative goal. And it might just be I don't want them to scrutinize me so much. I really want them to be open to me during this interview. I need an interviewing strategy. Well, that starts with behavioral analysis of everything we could possibly know about that individual as a foundation. And that from that, we craft a strategy to do that. What's interesting is when I would start to move into other spaces that weren't related to investigations, like unidentified aerial phenomena, but it still had to start from some behavioral foundation to try and understand why people think or believe the things that they do that might explain why they're acting this way or saying this. So it's not always an investigation context, but we try to have the same kind of approach.
Got it. Wow. Super fascinating.
Hmm.
You're
Well,
combining
in
the,
a way, sorry, but in a way aren't, and I don't mean this to sound cynical, I just think it's truthful, that
Hmm.
all long-term sustained relationships are manipulative at both ends. People know what works with the other person and they know what doesn't work with the other person. And they may have a particular goal in mind. You want to get him to agree to do Y or Z, and you have a way of proceeding
Hmm.
that you believe has more likelihood of success. It is a form of manipulation, but I think it is kind of one of the essential dynamics of human relationships.
but wait a minute, I'm gonna have to be idealistic here
Okay, well, of course you have to be idealistic. That's that's
and
that's your
say,
role.
yeah, like, what choice do I have? But it's also my sort of nature to look at statements like that and say, while it is true that manipulation is part of human behavior, and I get really pissed off when a parent says, "Oh, that kid's just being manipulative." I'm like, "Well, so are you. You want the kid to stop
Exactly.
crying,
Exactly.
like you
Right.
want a behavior you're trying to shape." But so that is all true. And as you go through, human development, we've sort of lost, I think, the understanding that at some stage you can have moments, if not your entire experience, but moments where you could say out loud, honey, I'm being manipulative. I just want you to do this thing. But in reality, I don't know what the right thing is. So it's when when we're convinced that we know the right answer for the thing for that this is going to work out better than this.
Right.
I want you to do the dishes in the sink. I don't want them to sit there. I'm very convinced that that's the right thing to do. But maybe it's not, because maybe the dishwasher's broken and we need to use the dishwasher for sanitary reasons, And so it's like at some point you could get to that developmental stage and not necessarily stay there, but have these moments. And so I think it's not the basis, but it is prevalent. Can we say that? The manipulation piece is not the basis of relationships, but it's prevalent.
I mean, I guess I try to I no, I think it is. I try to step out of, if I can, I try to step out of those rooms and like, let me look at it this way. I can appeal to you to do something, right? And say, like, I think this is a good thing if you donate to this cause or be part of this organization. If you're a member of a transnational criminal organization, I cannot appeal to you to do the right thing. I've got to employ techniques of influence and persuasion, which some could call manipulation, to try and get you to do that thing. And maybe you can't always know about how I'm doing that. I think that's where it's less about manipulation or an ethics thing, because I'm not trying to get you to do something that's ethically wrong. I'm trying to get you to do something that's going to help our investigation, or get to a place where it's like, this is the right thing to do. And sometimes it's something that's very obvious to people, like cases where families have been murdered, and I need people in that gang to come forward, because it's not okay. Uh, like, it's not okay at a minimum that children are killed, right? And I might have to influence those individuals to come forward. I think another way to even soften it, I think, to Carmen's point too, about like what's the natural dynamic of relationships, is I'll give you an example of how even among investigators that I'm trying to provide um, behavioral analysis to, or consulting to, how I would use this approach to soften or suggest to them a different way to look at things. If you look at a theory like theory of planned behavior with Asian and Fishbein, that's pretty well established, and that's really just talking about what's someone's attitude towards something. What do the people closest to them think about that? What are the broader social norms at play about that kind of topic, and how much control does that person think they have over it? If we take those three components, we have a good idea of what their behavioral intention is going to be. That's much different than the past predicts the behavior, your behavior. But if you use that framework, I think it frames a very naturalistic understanding of people's relationships and behaviors, and you can look at things like anticipated regret, right, and how that might shape how their behavioral intention might change. There is an example where an agency was having a difficult time with a couple who ran their own business, and this agency believed that this couple perhaps was being disloyal to the United States, that they were hiding things, that they were lying about their relationship and their witting knowledge of working with a foreign government. And that was undetermined. We're like, we don't know. But when we looked at the dynamics of what was actually happening in their communication with this couple, there appeared to be a lot of distrust from the American couple, and questions about, why are you still meeting with us? Why are you asking us these questions? And we had to be very candid with the agency of like, is it perhaps you're not sharing enough with them, that you're not explaining enough about why you're there? Like, I understand you gotta weigh transparency, and there's things that you can't share, but perhaps that's going on. But what we did in that situation was we applied the theory of planned behavior graphically to this business owner's attitude towards protecting her business. And of course, this is a theoretical exercise, right? It's just an exercise. We don't truly know everything we should know about her attitude towards it. But what we did know, based on those interactions, those interviews, her social media accounts, what she posts on there, any kind of reflection of her self concept, personality traits, her idealized self or aspirational self, we started to put these together, like things she would say. What would her attitude be towards her business? And what came out of that exercise is it's very possible what you're seeing and experiencing with her, especially, is she's very concerned about the future of their business because her and her husband were well past a typical retirement age, and it was just the two of them, and that she was really the one running the business. And she's concerned about protecting her business and the livelihood of their family, right?
Right.
And when she's faced with people from the government saying, raising questions about this and that, she's probably going to feel protective and even defensive. And
Yeah,
when we look
circle
at,
the wagons and yeah,
right, we said more than likely, this might actually be what you're seeing rather than someone who's being disloyal. Of course, we know like that's not definitive, but
right.
that was very important to kind of reframe their attitude, the investigators, towards how do we want to approach them a little bit differently because whatever strategy they were using was not effective. And at the end of the day, what we really needed to know was what's really happening here,
Yeah.
this foreign government. And in that sense, I would say, even though that's one example, I think that really challenges some questions of like what's ethical, is it manipulation? Because there are like real granular human needs to find out this stuff and to do it the right way. I would almost say that our approach with using the theory of planned behavior, doing that graphical exercise, and then crafting a different engagement strategy based on what we know about her was actually the ethical thing to do because what we saw was someone who had a very extreme bias towards this couple thinking they're
Mhm.
hiding stuff, they're lying about stuff, and that could have been very devastating to them and their business if that agency persisted in believing they're hiding stuff. So it's a
Yeah.
complicated, right? But it's just gray. It's a gray area.
But
um
you helped create a new perspective, and whether the perspective is accurate or not, it allowed them to get out of their sort of locked in position,
Right, right.
and then they're less of an us versus them.
yeah, right.
Well, very cool. What does this have to do with UAP? Like, what have you come like? Can you talk about UAP? Because I'm very curious. You know that
Sure.
I'm more interested in UAP than Carmen is for sure. But and I'm actually more interested not so much in the objects as in the way people interact with them and the experiences people have and what the heck is going on with
Mm.
that. It's like this, it's almost like becoming a new religion. And anyway, so I'm
So how
these are
did you come to develop an interest
Mm.
or expertise on sort of, can I say, sort of the behavior
Mhm.
of people who accept, uh, I don't want to, I'm not sure what are the straightforward words to use, so I'll let you say
Sure.
it.
If you, I mean, I joined BAU and started my training and certification as a profiler in 2018. And around the 2019 timeframe, I had already been looking at other behaviors that I guess we could call unexplained phenomena among individuals and groups of people. And based off of some of that research and study, that's when I started getting interested in UAP encounters. And it really started from a question of like, why does this group of pilots here believe this? And this group of pilots over here believe something different? What's going on there in terms of group dynamics? And so in 2019, I was essentially cold calling the Navy through some people I knew through NCIS of like, hey, I'm interested in this. And I knew that there was a UAP task force that at the time the Navy was responsible for. So I said, I'm trying to find someone in that task force. I'd like to talk about this. There might be some way that I can bring behavioral analysis in support of what they do. And that took a little while, but eventually they put me in touch with the person who was running that task force at the time. um, and we kind of had short discussions about like what my interest was, and it was that same starting point. Like, hey, I've done some study and research, operational research on group dynamics, on unexplained phenomena, on how ideas and beliefs spread among people, and why groups of people within the same organization have diverse viewpoints, especially on things related to this. And I'd like to share that. Maybe there's some way we can provide support. because the BAU doesn't just provide support to the FBI, it's any government agency that comes to them asking for support, particular projects. So we met at the Pentagon, and that was my first introduction to the kind of content they had and what they were doing. And I gotta say, I walked out of that first meeting. Some of the things I saw are now public, but at the time they weren't. And they still have things that aren't public, but I definitely had goosebumps. Definitely had goosebumps. I wish back then I had done some kind of index or survey myself on like the scale of my beliefs to look back now and be like, how have they changed? Because when I walked into that room, I think I was undecided, like a lot of people in this country, about like what do I believe is real, about what these things are, where they're from, those kind of things. But of course, in terms of like my professional discipline, I have to focus on the behavior at that time of like, this is why I'm here. That's what we really want to focus on. And that opened up discussions of, can we look at the behavior of UAPs? Can we establish a baseline of behavior for UAPs? But also, we still want to look at the group dynamics of pilots who claim they've had encounters and how other people respond to them. And that started that discussion. And that went on for several years. And there's different ways that we provided analysis to them. But I was fortunate that that included experiences interviewing pilots, even in group settings, where to me, I look back on the research literature out there and it validated. So that's the general starting point of how we got into that. And what I like about it is there was such a stigma tied to it, and I guess there still is, to people coming forward and saying, I had an encounter with a UAP. So we wanted to understand, like, is there a way to diminish that stigma? Is there a way to model behaviors so that other pilots feel comfortable coming forward? A lot of it was that. A lot of it was advice, guidance, analysis in that respect. I was really intent during that period of time, and this would have been 2019 to 2023, which is when I transitioned out of the FBI, on finding ways that the Navy and the government could really take the lead in modeling how to appropriately handle an approach to this. What I really admired about the UAP task force was their pretty bold approach of, well, we want to focus on data collection and analyzing the data. We're going to put aside that question of what are these things and just focus on actual collection. I think that was very important to approach it very differently this time. And I shared that approach with them. But in many ways, I always had an informal role with them. They didn't necessarily have a formal task force of people from all these different agencies at first. It was really just Navy and DoD personnel. But I was granted a lot of access to the things that they were looking at to try and look at different ways of approaching how we should talk to people, what we should consider. And it came back to a lot of these same questions of, who are they in a relationship with? What did they believe growing up? Whenever this happened, who did they tell about it? Those are all very important things that you don't typically find in um, traditional government approaches to collecting information. It's usually
Yeah.
when did this happen? Where were you? Those
Who,
kind of,
what, when, where, why, right now.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
There is, I'd say, as one example, in terms of trying to encourage pilots to be more comfortable with sharing things that happened. I think the Navy tried a lot of different ways that were often misunderstood by the public, and there are limits to what they could share of why they did the things they did. But again, the BAU and some of my activities in BAU, I was in a unique role that I'm going to consider things like strategic communication, how audiences respond to content and certain types of messaging. And so this kind of goes back to those same core foundational concepts. We need to have some kind of analysis of the audiences you're trying to reach and who you want to be the messenger. those basic models of persuasive communication that have been around for many decades. It's important who you choose as a messenger. It's important to consider your channel, and it's important to consider who's the receiver there. But being in a position, unlike perhaps some academics, where they are focused on theory and they can study that empirically to some extent, but being in a position where you can apply it operationally, investigatively, and see what worked and what didn't and why. It's a unique role. But I'm still reflecting on, like, well, how did this experience with looking at UAPs and how people responded to them, how did it change me? I would say from the first meeting I had with the Navy, when I walked out of that meeting to this day, one thing I can say is, okay, I believe that they're real. UAPs are real. And I think before that, I was like, I don't know, because I think that's still a step, just like it was still a step for the government to say these are real things. Maybe in the past they wouldn't have done that. I there's research back from the 70s, and I'm blanking on his name now, but a professor at the University of Western Michigan, a sociology professor. He looked at a lot of these dynamics. He was very interested in the sociology of information production and analysis. And he did look at UFOs in terms of like how people collect information and how they make sense of it and who it's shared with. But a great exemplar of a study he did was how people in the 19th century and before characterize meteorites and what they thought they were, and why people had all these ideas about what they were until scientists started getting more involved, right? And saying, this is what I think they are. And they were publishing studies on this. And this became much more accepted with the broader public of this is an established thing. It's okay to study it. And I was starting to see similar strides with the UAP task force of this is the approach you want to take. You want it to be much more empirical, data driven, which I liked. I don't know if that they really stayed the course with that. And the dynamic behind that again came down to, I think, even beyond my observation and beyond my experience, personalities and relationships and people having differing opinions about things. But that's the direction it started at. Later on, I feel like I saw a different direction and the analysis of these things from different agencies who got involved in this. And I had to encounter it even in my own agency. There's always a need to manage impressions with UAPs, always, because
Why?
I think fear of that stigma.
So can we talk about that,
Mm.
the fear of state that I gave a talk in Huntsville at the SCU meeting, a Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, about fear and taboo and how they drive this field and just destroy progress in the field
Mm.
because of this fear of what stigma is like a mark on you so that people could like and know that you're bad and you will be excluded from the social group, right?
Yeah.
It's what stigma is. And we do not want to be excluded. It's a matter of life or death, right?
Mm.
We live in communities, we live in tribes for a reason because we can't really survive alone. So stigma is a real fear. It's a legitimate fear, but where does it come from? It comes from this taboo that something that people have an impulse to do is wrong. And so we have to apply a stigma to get it so that people won't do the thing they have an impulse to do. So in this context, what do people have an impulse to do? I think people have an impulse to wonder and to be mystified,
Mm.
to um, to be in a state of awe. Here's something that we don't know and understand. Um, and to look at it, to observe it, to try to understand it. That's a healthy impulse.
Mm.
Why what is it? So I have an opinion about what I think it is that makes somehow that impulse a problem, but I'm curious what you will say about that. I personally, I think it's about the big, the big taboo is to admit that we don't understand. The big taboo is to admit that we don't have control. over everything in the sky, over everything in the water.
Hmm.
To me, that's the big taboo. Um, but maybe I'm wrong. And I don't know if you could talk about it.
And if
Yeah,
I could just, something I've been
please.
thinking, it's very similar. Uh, you're, as part of what you were doing, you were obviously talking to some pilots or observers who didn't report it or didn't apparently believe what they experienced was real or worth reporting. So I'm curious, how did you think of them? What do you think drove that behavior, which is kind of an adjunct to Julia's question?
Sure. I'd say my approach to this and my experience with it has been looking at group dynamics analysis. If we say like every group, and by group I mean that could just be a relationship between two people, or it could be a law firm, right? And when we look at organizations, whether there are boundaries or not, there's going to be tons of groups, right? Um, and so, what are the norms in those groups? And in a lot of these government agencies and in the military, there are definitely norms, definitely consensual social norms. And you don't want to violate those norms, or like Julia said, there could be you could be excluded in some way. And so I think that's a motivation. But things have to be normalized. I when there would be pilots who would openly say, I don't believe in these things, that wasn't surprising to me because I would just think about this in terms of, well, you have reasons for why you believe that. You have reasons why. It doesn't make you a weak individual that you're like not willing to believe. I think it's just this is how you've been shaped. It's kind of like when you look at something like different forms of bias or confirmation bias. I think a lot of times confirmation bias really gets a bad rap because people throw that out and say, like, that's confirmation bias. And you're not thinking through these things. But if you look at an analogy like an animal's not going to engage in behaviors to hurt itself. And people are the same way. So if people depend on certain sources of information and it shapes what they believe, it doesn't mean they're being backward about it. That's just their approach. And if I can understand it's actually a rational approach they're taking. So people who have been resistant to believing this thing that's unusual or they can't explain it is just one thing or another, or they're like, this is what I believe it is, and it's not aliens or something like that. I think they're being rational. That's just their approach to it. But I think it's norms. I mean, and also, again, maybe this goes into that space of manipulation or influence and persuasion. But when I was working on these things with the Navy UAP task force, there was definitely an effort from people that I worked with that they wanted to frame this in a particular way for my chain so that people didn't ridicule this, right? And so I think the broader government was doing this anyway when they would use a narrative of, well, we don't know what it actually is, and there could be a national security element to it. So an analogy I would see creeping up a lot in narratives for pilots was, well, it's kind of like sentries guarding a base. They need to report everything they see. Because if one doesn't report it, because like I don't know what that was and that's weird and I don't want to be ridiculed, that could that's a vulnerability, right? Someone could be hurt. That analogy landed really well with people in the military, right? Because that makes sense. And if you use something like, for all you know, this could be a foreign military or foreign government, that makes people feel more comfortable too. So I wouldn't say it's manipulation, but these are narratives that people responded well to. I would also see humor used a lot to soften this, where people that actually saw it for what it really was, which is there's unexplained phenomena that might have spiritual and other dimensions as well that we can't explain. But when I brief this to executives, I'm going to go ahead and make a joke up front about little green men, right?
Yes,
It's
right.
tough. Yeah, I think there's some performative aspect to it to say like, yeah, I know what jokes you probably have, and I don't believe in that. We're approaching this in a very serious manner. And in terms of norms, and roles in group dynamics, certainly you could argue it's much more acceptable for someone like me in my position at that time with BAU to much more openly question these things and say, I really want to understand this. If I was just an agent on an investigative squad, that would not be as acceptable. It wouldn't. And I think I also was somewhat influenced early on at looking at some profiles that were done in the media on various figures from the military that had come forward to talk about UAPs. And there were interesting pieces. And of course, I know there's a subjective element to it. But what was interesting about those pieces is it suggested maybe this is actually beneficial to people to come forward. There used to be an idea, or there still is, that if you come forward and talk about UFOs, you're going to be made fun of and you're going to lose your credibility. But as people are doing this more, there has been suggestion that actually this is very beneficial to them because they get a lot of attention, a lot of airtime. That's their new persona. And they can adopt these narratives that are okay with people like, well, I was in a privileged role. I had access to thing that other people don't. And now I can't talk about it. And you can't verify either way if it's real or not. And you can go in all those different directions. And of course I was skeptical of that. But being in the BAU and being a profiler, I think people just assumed that's normal. That's acceptable that you would look into that. And good or bad, I think there's a lot of reputational pedigree that comes with the BAU, whether it's from popular culture or elsewhere, that people think, oh, this is an esteemed position. You're not going to be a silly person talking about little aliens. You're going to approach this in a much more serious manner, which I did, and I tried to do that. What did really surprise me, and I really appreciated professionally and as an individual, is behind closed doors and in some of the stuff that's not public. I think people are much more open to accepting there's other dimensions to this that we just don't understand yet as people, right? That this could be biological, this could be spiritual, this could
Yeah.
be, and I really appreciated that because even in the BAU, again, the question of norms and stigma, it would not have been acceptable to always take a religious view or framework to analysis of things, right? It wouldn't
Right.
have been acceptable. We need to
Right,
have
it's not allowed.
it's not, because people are like, you're biased, you're much too driven
Right, right.
by your lens and experience, and it's like, but this could be a play here, but that wouldn't have been acceptable. You would need to look at some other kind of approach in research literature and psychology that would explain what's really happening here. And that got very difficult when you were talking about people who, yeah, based on your own individual beliefs, really might be wrestling with a lot of demons in their life, spiritual and otherwise. And how much does that impact what's going on here? It would change the whole discussion.
Yeah.
And that still did not creep out much when I would see limited things in groups where it's like, if you look at an organization like MUFON, I'm trying to remember what the acronym stands for, but it's like, like there's chapters around the US of amateur UAP.
Mutual UFO network, but
Yeah.
their
There,
Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies sort of sucked that in, and
okay, yeah, I remember I've been to one MUFON meeting once.
yeah,
I just wanted, and I was just going as a someone to watch, and it was quite an experience for me
yeah,
because someone asked me in line, "Are you an experiencer?" And I didn't know what they were talking about.
Mm,
That, and it definitely introduced me to a lot of different personalities. And still, when I see the presentations they have, yeah, there is definitely an air to the narrative there that the government is not sharing as much as it has. Meanwhile, my own individual experience was very different. I repeatedly felt that really what this is that the government doesn't know what this is. And unfortunately, they're very limited in resources and budget and personnel to really tackle this. I mean, as one brief example, it was always a struggle to see former military personnel choosing to go on, say, the History Channel to talk about their experience with UAPs rather than talking to the UAP task force.
Right.
And so, one of my suggestions was like, you really need to build artifacts of credibility here, even if it's just brief studies of interviews done with various pilots. That's going to lend you credibility in the face of people going on the History Channel talking about their experience, including the people who actually don't have access and real information about what's happening, going on TV and sharing narratives that are maybe a little conspiratorial. I think people generally don't like that answer, that my experience has shaped me, that I'm like, I don't think the government really knows what's going on. And
That's
that's
the
what,
big,
No,
that's
no,
the big taboo. That's the big taboo.
Tim, I know that's true, that people, when you tell them what you really experienced and, know yourself, they don't believe you. They just, they believe you were either not important enough to know the truth
yeah.
or lying, one or the other. Then, that's the default.
But see, it's innocent. That desire is innocent. And that is the desire of all conspiracy theories. It's the desire to believe that people in charge know more than you, because it's scary to think
That they don't.
that they
No.
don't.
It's reassuring to have that conspiracy theory in a way.
That all conspiracy theories
Yeah.
are reassurance of that the parent knows what they're doing.
Exactly. So we are really at 10:30, which was our
Oh, yeah,
scheduled time.
I cannot believe it. Okay. 2 seconds
So
on.
what, I mean, we can always make this a two-parter. That's always an option, but what, Julia, your two things.
I'm just hoping that you're willing to have the last thing you say anything about, because you briefly mentioned behavioral analysis of UAP themselves. And I think one of the things that we forget to do is apply theory of mind to UAP. Like, and we treat them as machines that don't have any intelligence behind them or in them. And, but obviously they seem to have a capacity to reveal themselves when they want to be revealed and hide themselves when they want to hide. So there must be a theory of mind there. And so do we have to do a second episode on that? Because I don't know how you're going to answer that.
No, I could answer it briefly. That question came up many times, including with some of my peers, of like, we need to consider this because there is no baseline. There is no baseline for UAP behaviors, right? And there needs to be, because otherwise, how can we make any sense of the behaviors we're seeing, right? There is definitely a need for that, and our concern was there wasn't enough data for that, and there is a lot of disparity in like the credibility of some of the data. I agree with you. There has to be. I don't know if there. Yes, that is a longer conversation. It was definitely an aspirational goal. Like, we want that because if you apply it to the other examples of behavioral analysis I was giving, even if we're talking about anecdotes, if we have that baseline, then perhaps we have an opportunity to communicate. We have an
Right.
opportunity to
Yes.
induce a
Yeah.
response,
Yes.
which is what people want, so they can
Yes.
change. Right.
Yes. It's like a country you don't know anything about. So, you have to develop a theory of what
Sure.
happens in that country.
Exactly.
Wow.
Well, thank you.
I got to tell you real quickly, I went last summer up to the White Mountains in New Hampshire, where the very famous UFO abduction is reported to have occurred. The couple and
Yeah.
Barney Hill and
yes, the couple,
yes.
and they have, it's a New Hampshire historical monument there. I mean, it's officially recognized as one of the New Hampshire history plaques. And, there's a lot of information and original articles from the time. And it was just very interesting. These are individuals who,
Betty and Barney Hill.
yeah, it's unclear well, it was clear to them what happened, but what their motivations would have been to do anything other than simply tell what they experienced was just
Yeah.
not at all evident to me. It was evident that they were telling what they thought happened to them.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, we have to get over this idea that the only thing that's real are physical objects.
Yes, absolutely.
Experience is real,